The human mind is an expansive, mysterious, elastic property. To this day, our understanding of how it operates remains a mystery, and while we don't know much, we do know the mind gives context to all things we hold dear. Falling in love, winning that football game, and most importantly, in my opinion, experiencing art. Without the mind-soul experiencing these things, they would simply be unknowable phenomena. The emotions and wonder one experiences when viewing the majestic grandeur of the David, the sly sensuality of the Mona Lisa, are what give these artistic triumphs power. And of course, this same principle can be ascribed to music. But there are layers to this. What if instead of just experiencing base emotions such as love, joy, lust, or triumph, music could take us into even deeper recesses of the mind, to places where questions of existence, consciousness, ego, and transcendence combine. This musical phenomenon does exist, and it is known as psychedelic music. And in this video, we will take a look at the entire kaleidoscopic history of this particular musical phenomena. Now, if we go to the current dictionary definition of psychedelic music, most musicological experts will point to its genesis being in the late 1960s. However, in many ways, psychedelic music has its origins decades and decades before that pivotal era. Now, before we go over the history of this amazing music in detail, it is important to know where the word psychedelic even comes from. The term psychedelic, as far as we know, was first introduced to the public vernacular by English psychologist Humphrey Osmond in 1956. In fact, it is a portmanteau of two Greek words, psyche, meaning mind, soul, and self, and delein, meaning to manifest, which can roughly be understood to mean the manifestation of the soul. The invention of the word was spurred by conversations Osmond had with Brave New World author Aldous Huxley about the peculiar experience of ingesting lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, as it is commonly known. Huxley himself was the first to use the term psychedelic in any written work, and it subsequently became a catch-all phrase for mind expansion induced by hallucinogens. Music made that stimulated many of these same sensory experiences or enhanced a trip became to be known as psychedelic music. While the word psychedelic was first codified in 1956, these dreamlike, mind-altering forms of music certainly existed before then. Now, the debate of when the first characteristics of psychedelic music came into existence at the current moment is still an open one. A strong candidate to some is Hector Berlioz' 1830 composition Symphonie Fantastique, which uses the orchestra to illustrate an opium-induced nightmare of lost love and desire. For others still, going all the way back to the Middle Ages, the morality music plays of Hildegard von Bingen provide a starting point when mind imagery and music melded together. And while these are interesting discussions, the point where music definitively took on not just a programmatic nature, but a mind-expanding nature was the 1894 premiere of Claude Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. Now, in order to understand Debussy, and why his music sounded like it did, it is important to understand two artistic movements that were happening in the late 19th century: Impressionism and Symbolism. The former is to this day still a controversial term when applied to Debussy, while the latter more accurately describes the music of pieces like Prelude to the Afternoon for a Faun or La Mer. Impressionism was a reactionary movement against the then highly regimented and conservative-minded Paris visual arts community under Emperor Napoleon III. By utilizing abstract brushstrokes, Impressionist painters tried to capture real life in a way only art could, in a hazy, vague, yet beautiful sense that only existed in the blurred memories and emotions of human society. All that being said, this was a movement that, according to Debussy himself, he had nothing to do with. Ever since he appeared on the music scene, critics from the 1890s to today have attempted to attach the Impressionist label to Debussy's music, due to its dreamlike, abstract, and dare I say, mind-expanding qualities. That being said, due to Debussy's and many subsequent critics' rejection of his association with the Impressionist movement, I think it pertinent to go over a movement with which he had much more apparent ties, that being the symbolist movement. While Debussy never referred to himself as a symbolist, it is well known that a series of symbolist writings provided the inspiration for the aforementioned Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun and his lone majestic opera Pelléas et Melisandre. So what is symbolism? Well, allow this quote from Jean Marissa, a famous symbolist writer, to explain. In his famous Symbolist Manifesto, he stated, "Thus, in this art movement, representation of nature, human activities, and all real-life events don't stand on their own. They are rather veiled reflections of the senses, pointing to archetypical meanings through their esoteric connections." Thus, in this declaration, we see an outline for a philosophical approach to art that is far more in line with Debussy's evocation of dreamlike states, abstract emotions, and unknowable knowledge. And this is above all else why the history of psychedelic music starts with Debussy. So, all that being said, what specifically about Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun was so psychedelic, you ask? Well, let's take a look at the piece briefly. When we dive into the music, we actually see quite a few similarities between Debussy and a band like The Doors. First off, the piece contains multiple odd meters, Eastern musical influences, and a loose, if not non-existent structure to further the symbolist/psychedelic experience of a faun luxuriating on a sunny afternoon. As the piece continues to unfurl, it becomes more and more abstract until finally ending in a calm yet elated state. While audiences at the time might not have realized it, Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun was a definitive move away from simply programmatic music to inner, emotional, mind-expanding music. While the psychedelic values that Debussy pioneered faded into the background of orchestral music in favor of various different strains of composing in the early 20th century, these ideas and themes ended up finding a new home in the burgeoning electronic music composition scene. And nowhere was this more obvious than in the movement of the Italian Futurists. Now, the Futurists on first glance do not look like they would have anything to do with the sublime aesthetics of the symbolists and composers like Debussy. The music of the Italian Futurists was jarring, nonsensical, and oftentimes unsettling. It was very much a music of the body, of the exterior, not the inner. So what did it have to do with the development of the concept of psychedelia? Well, despite its exteriority and physicality, it is Futurism's radical departure from traditional instrumentation and the innovation of electronic composition within the movement that ultimately provided the building blocks of the sonic textures of modern psychedelia. In Italian futurist Luigi Russolo's 1913 treatise The Art of Noises, he describes the evolution of not just sound, but the distinctive phenomena known as noise, and how it only came to be as a result of the unique circumstances of Industrial Revolution era Europe. The sounds of machines clanging, steam engines exhaling, and the development of voltage-controlled sound, all of it, according to Russolo, was ripe for artistic exploitation, specifically in the field of sound or even music. In fact, according to Russolo, in order for the creation of music to keep up with and be relatable to the then current state of humanity, it was paramount that composers begin to incorporate these concepts into modern composition. By creating within these frameworks, the Futurists were musical forerunners of modern psychedelia's spaced-out and tripped-out sonic landscapes. And while the Futurists certainly laid the groundwork in the earliest decades of the 20th century for a new style of music, it was the successor movement to the Futurists that really shook things up. That style of music was known as Musique Concrete. Now, there are a number of known Musique Concrete composers of important renown, Pierre Schaeffer, Janis Joplin, to name two. But I am going to focus on a specific composer who did more to advance the principles of pre-60s psychedelia than any other, and brought the purely physical and carnal influence of the Futurists back under control and used it to explore the astral realm. That man was Edgard Varese. Edgard Varese was born in France in 1883, but ended up later immigrating to the United States, where he ended up composing his most influential work. Coming from both a musical and scientific background, Varese started in the traditional classical sphere before moving further towards electronic composition, tape loops, and the general trappings of what was to become Musique Concrete. His innovations in these fields, particularly in a piece like Poème électronique, were incalculably important to the development of later psychedelic music. It's hard to believe that the Beatles' use of tape manipulation in Tomorrow Never Knows or Strawberry Fields Forever would have ever been possible without Varese and his dogged pursuit of incorporating tape into the orchestra. Additionally, his innovative use of voltage-controlled electricity to create melodies was an essential influence, knowingly or not, on purely electronic late 60s psychedelic bands such as Silver Apples or the foundational synthesizer work of Wendy Carlos and Morton Subotnick. And I would be remiss here if I did not mention Frank Zappa. It is well known that in Frank Zappa's young life, no composer exerted a greater creative hold on him than Edgar Varese. The two even corresponded via telephone and letters. The reason to mention this was while I would never consider Frank Zappa a part of the 60s psychedelic scene, in fact, he often spent time on his records lampooning what he thought were vacuous hippies, Zappa often served as the conduit between the mainstream rock world of people like the Beatles, Cream, and Pink Floyd, and the cutting-edge avant-garde classical world that included people like Stockhausen and Edgar Varese. Through Zappa, we can see a direct line of how the Musique Concrete movement, pioneered by Varese and others, made its way into the rock scene and contributed greatly to the birth of the 60s psychedelic scene. Now, before we get into the creme de la creme, so to speak, of this video, and talk directly about the late 60s psychedelic era, there is still one more period in the 20th century we need to explore in the evolution of psychedelic music, and that is the music of the space age. I have done a few videos already on this subject, as this pre-rock yet post-classical period continues to fascinate me, not just with how unique it was, but how to this day its influence and trippy nature continues to be discounted in the course of music history. In order to explain the space age music scene, I am going to insert clips here from some of my earlier videos going over the scene in detail to give you more context. The early 1960s were a very peculiar, interesting, and transformative time in the history of Western music. The initial waves of swing music and early rock and roll had begun to peter out as forms of mass popular entertainment. Jazz had reduced in size from big band ensembles to small modal quartets, and the dominance of rock music, spurred by the Beatles, was still quite a few years away. What was left in the intermediary years was known as the Space Age era of music. While the late 60s psychedelic era is often equated with terms such as the Wild West and trippy, in reality it was actually a much more cohesive scene than the disparate yet fascinating music of the Space Age era. Within Space Age music, one had tiki or exotica music, avant-garde electronic guitar pop like that of Joe Meek and the Tornadoes, and the wild stereophonic Latin ensemble experiments of someone like Esquivel. So I hope it is clear from these clips that the Space Age era of music was a very trippy time in music that flew under the radar in many ways due to its target audience of mainstream suburban America. The initial influence of Debussy was reintroduced, and the electronic innovations of the Futurists and the Musique Concrete were brought to dizzying new heights. Throw in the addition of the stereophonic recording innovations of Esquivel, and you have by far the trippiest, most spaced-out form of music anyone had heard up until that point. However, due to the nature of post-World War II America and the West's general conservative nature, the concepts espoused in these mostly instrumental records were nothing that would cause anyone to question anything. Well, perhaps other than Can I Get Another Mai Tai. However, there was one exception and seminal record during this period that bucked that trend. That record was Yma Sumac's Voice of Extabe. In a field of fellow artists who maintained a conservative persona, Yma Sumac served as a much more expansive forerunner of what psychedelia would become. It's hard to believe, looking at the album cover of The Voice of Extabe, that it was released in 1950. Even more unbelievable was the music contained inside. On the record, composer and arranger Les Baxter manipulates the studio orchestra to create Debussy-esque dreamlike passages, which Yma Sumac then primally sings, whoops, and screams over, all with a magnificently clear 5-octave range comparable to that of a professional opera singer. All in all, for a record that predated the psychedelic era by roughly 20 years, it managed to have a lot more in common with Janis Joplin than it did Bing Crosby or Ella Fitzgerald. So here we are, everybody, at the crux and core of this video, the music of the 60s psychedelic explosion. Now, here's where I want to take a slightly different route for exploring in depth the music of the late 60s. Usually in any documentary about this period, and trust, there have been literally hundreds at this point, most often the focus has been on psychedelic rock, the classics we all know and love, and that will for sure make up a substantial part of this section of the video. However, what I think tends to get overlooked, and that could be because of the biases of the demographic of people who usually make these types of documentaries, is the simultaneous explosion of the psychedelic soul and psychedelic folk scene that happened at the same time. So, with that said, let's begin. Now, many people know the 60s were perhaps the most singularly radical decade of the 20th century. What started with Chubby Checker's The Twist ended with Sly and the Family Stone's I Want to Take You Higher. And while there were shifts from the beginning to end in every decade, including our most recent one, to this day, I still maintain the cultural shift that took place from 1960 to 1969 was the most radical and abrupt we saw during the latter half of the 20th century, and it's incredibly pertinent that we dive into the reasons why the musical culture of this decade changed so radically and quickly. First, unrelated to the thriving space age pop scene, there was a parallel scene growing around the love of jazz music that included writers, artists, and fellow musicians. This was known as the Beatnik scene. The Beatnik scene was important for numerous reasons. They codified the glorification of America's native music styles over those from Europe, or rather, jazz over classical. Additionally, they challenged the social mores of the day and the general white Protestant framework of morals and ethics that had dominated America from its founding up till the 1950s. They emphasized individual freedom over the oppressiveness of the conservative collective, or as one might say, letting your freak flag fly. On a more base level, they advocated for the taking of drugs and illicit substances to unchain the self from the doldrums of post-World War II suburbanized Western life. And this is where the influence of the Beatnik scene becomes tantamount to the development of psychedelic music. Before the taking of illicit drugs became synonymous with the Beatnik circle, they had already formed a philosophy diametrically opposed to the restrictive Christian culture of the day. But it must be noted this was a rather secular or earthly objection to Christianity, not a celestial one. But with the introduction of hallucinogens, specifically lysergic acid diethylamide or LSD, the Beatniks began to take on a much more spiritual objection to the banality of 20th century Christian capitalist society. And it was this spirituality that began the evolution of the Beatnik movement into the hippie movement that would then spawn the psychedelic music scene. The combining of the spiritual and philosophical perspectives of the hippies with the musical philosophy of experimentation that had culminated with the space age pop artists was the impetus for the beginning of the psychedelic music scene. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in exploring the 60s psychedelic scene, I will attempt to take a more expansive view of mind-expanding music, including musicians from all backgrounds, and in doing so, try to give a more holistic view of the scene than the typical psychedelic documentaries. Also, because I will be including the entire constellation of artists and genres here, the period we will be covering will range a bit longer than the typical 1966 to 1970 period, and will look more like 1967 to 1973 to capture the full range of psychedelia from this time. Anyway, let's get started. The 1960s really was where it all came together. It was the culmination of the musical revolutions from the prior 70 years exploding into new sonic dimensions. The philosophy and the music were finally in sync, and coupled with new innovations, this ensured it would be the most innovative era of studio-based music to date. And what were these new innovations, you ask? Well, electronic feedback coming into use as a musical compositional element, a spiritual successor to the noise of the Italian Futurists and the Musique Concrete, exploration and full incorporation of Eastern musical influences into the canon of contemporary songwriting, mostly featuring music of the Indian subcontinent, and in particular, the study and use of ragas, the konakol, and other techniques from Carnatic or South Indian classical music. Exploration outside the traditional blues rock framework into various modal and atonal forms of composition and songwriting, building on the space age pop studio innovations by featuring detailed tape splicing, backwards echo and reverb, heavy overdubs, and recording of reverse tape. Lyrics that codified the philosophical concepts from the lineage of the Symbolists all the way up to the Beatniks. Now, this is a list, broadly, of the characteristics that defined psychedelic music in the 1960s. And if you've listened to any of the more popular mainstream psychedelic records of the time, you've definitely heard these techniques in action. From the feedback-induced haze of Jimi Hendrix and Cream, to the rootsy-esque jams of the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, to the weird noise experiments of Pink Floyd, each artist chose to interpret the ideals of this movement through his or her own unique lens. All these aforementioned artists made the psychedelic rock music scene what it was. They pioneered the festival as a new form of live music entertainment, flaunted conservative sexual mores, and protested the necessity of war, specifically the Vietnam War. It was an incredible time, and trying to go over every amazing, world-changing, innovative album would be a whole other video. And in the 1 out of 1,000 chance you haven't heard the music of any of these artists, go listen now, please, I implore you. Now, that roughly is the psychedelic rock scene of the 1960s. I'll admit it may seem like I have spent comparatively less time than most on this section of psychedelia, mostly because it is so well known and talked about, at this point I feel pointing out how amazing Electric Ladyland is for the 18th time would be a bit of overkill. Instead, I want to shift and show how psychedelia impacted other genres that don't get as much play, the first being the genesis and creation of psychedelic soul. Now, psychedelic soul's evolution is a bit hard to pin down. Unlike rock music of the 60s, which was highly individualized, soul music had a much more centralized top-down approach, and this was due to the two big labels at the time, Atlantic and Motown, controlling a lion's share of the soul music market. In this way, the soul music apparatus was able to pump out new hits and act at a pace no other genre could match. I guess if you're looking for an analogy today, think K-pop, but in the 60s, and American. While this made the soul music industry much more adept at conquering the charts than other genres, it often put label bosses at odds with the artists on their roster. As the artists were contemporaries of the hippie generation, they were aware of the changing musical aesthetic that was taking place at the end of the decade, and very much wanted to participate in it themselves. However, since label heads exerted unilateral control over musical style and visual aesthetics, and were of an older generation, they were loath to change quickly despite the changing times. However, it was the introduction and explosion of one group who changed the direction of everything. There can be no conversation about psychedelic soul without mentioning Sly and the Family Stone. People to this day still underestimate the singularity of influence Sly had over numerous genres, artists, and movements. In fact, many artists we love today would not have existed had Sly and the Family Stone not done what they did in the 1960s. Interestingly, Sly actually bucked the trend of label-directed soul artists, as the Family Stone was formed in San Francisco autonomously and then later signed to Epic, not Atlantic or Motown. Sticking with soul music's gospel-infused vocals and rhythms, but adding layers of fuzz, feedback, and the aforementioned studio production techniques, Sly & Co. birthed fundamental building blocks that came to characterize psychedelic soul, not to mention funk. With songs like I Wanna Take You Higher, Everyday People, and Hot Fun in the Summertime, Sly took the soul music template and amped it up on all the psychedelic characteristics in vogue at the time. Following this, the rest of the soul music industry began to take notice, with the Temptations ditching their earlier wholesome sound for songs like Papa Was a Rolling Stone. With its heavy wah-wah based riff and rougher gang vocals, it was clear the counterculture had arrived at Motown Records. And of course, no Psych Soul overview would be complete without mentioning Parliament and Funkadelic. P-Funk's ability to combine the best of Hendrixian riffage and chording in the playing of Eddie Hazel with the gospel yelps and hollers of George Clinton laid the groundwork for the continuation and exploration of psychedelic soul in the 1970s, particularly on albums like Cosmic Slop, the self-titled debut album, and the aptly titled Free Your Ass and Your Mind Will Follow. Funkadelic created a unique sonic landscape using psychedelic elements of the 60s and then expanding them further by adding grittier subject matter and production techniques that ended up creating an influential style of psychedelic soul that influenced everyone from Prince to the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And lastly, psychedelic soul saw its biggest influence in the genre of Philly soul. Again, emphasizing how in many ways everything really does go back to Debussy, Philly soul kept all the aforementioned innovations while reintroducing the full orchestral template back into the composition, songwriting, and recording process. Just taking a quick look at a track like Didn't I Blow Your Mind This Time by the Delphonics, we can see all of this in full effect. So soul music did indeed undergo a drastic psychedelic transformation in the late 60s, in addition to rock music. But what a lot of people don't know is that, in fact, another genre from the earlier 60s and 1950s underwent a massive transformation as the 60s came to a close, and that genre was folk music. So I think it's worth it to spend just a bit of time exploring the phenomena that was psychedelic folk. Now, the most prominent name when this genre is invoked in conversation, if it ever is these days, is that of Donovan. With a series of #1 hits on the Billboard Hot 100 chart, he was by far the most mainstream of the psychedelic folk artists. Songs like Sunshine Superman, Season of the Witch, and Hurdy-Gurdy Man laid out in the most palatable ways the psychedelic folk template. In Hurdy-Gurdy Man in particular, strummed acoustic guitars open the song with a soft vocal, only to be interrupted by a jarring and prominent sitar, which is then followed by a double-tracked and heavier, folkier vocal extolling the ways of the Hurdy-Gurdy Man, whoever that is. This combination of Dylan-esque lyrics and strumming mixed with the psychedelic template of sitars and production technique, although Psych Folk was less heavy on studio trickery than the other genres, proliferated not only throughout Donovan's music, but that of Jake Holmes, who wrote the original Dazed and Confused, later stolen, covered by Led Zeppelin, Syd Barrett, early Mark Bolan T-Rex records, Tim Buckley, and Nick Drake, just to name a few. While the sound of psychedelic folk would fade by the mid-70s, it would go on to become influential in the sound of bands like The Cure or artists like Robin Hitchcock. And so these three genres of psychedelic music twisted their way into the mainstream of popular culture in the late, with psychedelic rock fading away first in favor of a more back-to-roots hard rock sound from bands like Led Led Zeppelin. Psychedelic folk held on for a bit longer before fading into a more mainstream folk sound from artists like James Taylor, Carole King, or Jim Croce. Only psychedelic soul lasted into the mid-70s with artists like the aforementioned Funkadelic and the Delphonics. However, that too morphed into something more palatable by the end of the 70s in the form of disco music. Now, the next question is, of course, what happened to the musical template and aesthetic of psychedelia in the 1970s? And the answer to that is very interesting indeed. The 1970s were in many ways an inverse of the 1960s. While the 60s had ended in a colorful explosion of genre mashing and collaboration, the 70s were highly segmented. Bands that had pioneered psychedelic rock ended up spawning descendants that became much more pared down and lean. Think the trippy acid rock of the Jimi Hendrix experience versus the down-to-earth roots of a band like Aerosmith. And as such, much of the previous three aforementioned strains of psychedelia did indeed die out. However, the concepts and sounds pioneered in 60s psychedelia did end up finding new homes in the space music artists of the 1970s. A mainstream band like Pink Floyd comes to mind as an example of this, but even more than that, the obscure underground that contained artists like Tangerine Dream, Vangelis, Jean-Michel Jarre, and Brian Eno, among others, were what defined spaced-out music in the 1970s. And while yes, progressive rock was also developing a form of out-there music at this time in the form of bands like Yes, Gentle Giant, and King Crimson, its emphasis on tight playing and technical acrobatics often put it in direct contrast with the expanding space music scene. So, focusing on space music, what were the characteristics of this genre? Well, if we pull an example from Vangelis' Heaven and Hell, we get a pretty good framework. The album contained giant expansive rock tone paintings powered by Moore's Law advancing synthesizers of the day with heavy classical influences. In addition, in an artist like Jean-Michel Jarre, there was less overt classical influence, but more of an emphasis on the ambiance of the environment. See where I'm going with this? And this, my friends, is where we have to talk about Brian Eno. Brian Eno's series of albums in the late 70s single-handedly invented ambient music. That is not in doubt. In combining earlier influences of people like Eric Satie, a psychedelic forefather, with the modern ability of the studio to create space-like effects, Eno developed a style that could be both background and foreground depending on the desires of the listener. Now, is ambient music psychedelic music? There may be disagreement here, but due to its heady and mind-expanding aspects, I will classify it as such. Acts like Harold Budd, Daniel Lanois, and later in the 90s, Oval and Aphex Twin all furthered psychedelia by using ambient music to stimulate the inner dimensions of the mind. But looking at ambient music in the late 70s, we can see that this was in contrast to the much harder-edged approach of basically everybody else at that time. And as the 70s drew to a close and punk and new wave were more popular than ever, where would the path for trippy music be in the 1980s? Was there even a path left to tread? The 1980s at first glance looks like it would be one of the least hospitable decades to the values pioneered in the psychedelic music from the 60s. If anything, Reagan's supply-side economics and social conservatism appeared to make it, at best, hospitable to some sort of space-age pop revival, foregoing much of psychedelia's ideological stance. However, major innovations in psychedelic music did indeed take place during this decade. While the Paisley Underground, featuring bands like Dream Syndicate and the Bangles, attempted to revive some of the sounds of the late 60s and did have some commercial success with this, the real sound of psychedelia in the 1980s and early 90s was that of acid house. The transition to acid house as the primary progenitor of psychedelia heralded quite a few important changes to how psychedelic music was produced and perceived in the waning days of the 20th century. Primarily, psychedelic music became an acousmatic form of music due to the way in which acid house was produced. While the previously mentioned ambient and space music artists of the 70s had mostly abandoned guitars as the primary instrument for creating expansive soundscapes, they had still kept real-time playing with the use of synthesizers intact. However, acid house fully removed this real-time element by using the Roland TB-303 and TR-808 as primary tools of composition. The sound of acid house was as hypnotic as any of the best Brian Eno ambient records, except on a totally different frequency. The much higher BPM indebted the style to disco, which itself had descended from psychedelic soul, while the heavy washes of reverb and phasing indebted to the experimentalism of artists like Vangelis and Jean-Michel Jarre. In addition, values of free love, anti-establishment sentiment, and the introduction of ecstasy furthered the rise of acid house as the new form of psychedelia. So much so that in 1988, England declared the country was in the middle of a, quote, second summer of love. Acid house, while never exactly having mainstream hits on the chart, continued to dominate the underground and served as a stark alternative to the conformist attitudes of 1980s Western culture. And it laid the bedrock for the even more twisting and strange turns electronic music would take throughout the 90s. Now, the 90s as an era for psychedelia was interesting in that many previous styles from the 60s through the space celestial music of the 70s were revived with an indie or alternative take from bands like Jellyfish, The Screaming Trees, or The Flaming Lips. But more prominently, it was the shoegaze sound pioneered by bands like My Bloody Valentine and Slowdive that brought a spaced-out, inward experience back to music. And interesting to note, at this time, psychedelic-derived music shifted back away from electronics to guitars as the primary sound generator of heady sonic architecture, as evidenced by shoegaze. Now, I am not trying to gloss over the 90s as a decade, as there was so much innovation done in so many genres. However, in terms of strict psychedelia and the tenets we have established to define it, it is a little hard to pin down movement, as there were not as many clearly defined ones as in the aforementioned decades. Certainly, as mentioned before, ambient music continued to evolve and reconstitute itself in strange ways, and shoegaze continued to innovate and expand what a guitar could do. However, outside those two genres, the 90s was very much similar to the 70s, in that it pared a lot of things back down and took a much more earthly, raw approach to music making. However, many of the recording innovations that began in the 90s, specifically the triumph of digital recording over analog, led to numerous new possibilities in psychedelic music. So this brings us to the 2000s through to today. Where has the ideas and concepts of psychedelia been in the last 20 years, and where is it going? Well, in the 2000s, we saw a fusion of multiple different approaches to psychedelia come together. Acousmatic, non-acousmatic, guitar-based, synthesizer-based, and a new element of sample-based psychedelia, or sampleadelia, were all introduced in this decade, and this bright melange is no better encapsulated than in a band like Animal Collective. With Beach Boys-esque harmonies, heavy thick synthesizers, and digital manipulation of vocals, Animal Collective, for many people, including me, who grew up in the 2000s, were the definitive psychedelic band. On albums like Strawberry Jam and Merriweather Post Pavilion, Animal Collective created a kaleidoscopic sound invoking the best of psychedelia's past, present, and future. Their innovative blend of sounds influenced everyone from Beyoncé to the XX. On the electronic side of things, the acid house tendencies and Brian Eno-ish obsession with ambience come together perfectly in an artist like John Hopkins. Hopkins himself has explicitly stated that psychedelics and psychedelic culture and lore play a big part in his music-making process, and this can be clearly heard on not only his latest release, titled Music for Psychedelic Therapy, but especially on an album like Singularity, where a peyote-inspired trip to the desert is soundtracked by some of the greatest mind-expanding electronic music that has ever been made. But artists like Frank Ocean and J. Paul could be considered part of the grand story of psychedelia. On both these artists' classic releases, modern Timbaland-style R&B productions are paired with, again, an element of spaced-out electronics to create a soundscape that is both passionate and celestial in nature. And of course, we cannot talk about psychedelia in the 21st century without mentioning the innovations of Kevin Parker and Tame Impala. On records such as the now classic Currents, Tame Impala truly presents the definitive form of modern psychedelia. Digital manipulation, heavy guitars, vocals treated with new technologies such as the isotope vocal synth, all come together to create a sound tapestry that opens up new paths forward for spaced out music, both on the lighter and heavier side. And with acts like King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard continuously releasing albums, newer alt R&B and electronic acts constantly incorporating psychedelia, the genre, ideology, and mindset seems to have a lot of life left in it yet. Psychedelic impulses from the late 19th century to today continue to be the impetus for musicians to explore the outer reaches of the sonic universe, and if the long-storied past of the music is any indicator, the future of the music promises to be mighty, mighty trippy, my friends. So go chill under a tree and listen to everyone from Debussy to Kevin Parker. You won't regret it. Peace and love. Peace and love.